Welcome to Small Talk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of Small Talk, I'm going to be joined once again by Sina, Kahen, and Jackson Gardner, and we'll be discussing the new volume published, Pirush Ibn Kaspi, Megillas Esther, in English, Understanding Megillat Esther, Ibn Kaspi's commentary in the Book of Esther, published by Dot Press. So thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tell the listeners a little bit about this book.
So, I was going away seeing what are the different perushim that exist on Megillat Esther and what are the different takes that the Hachamim have. And one that really stood out to me, that I came across a few years ago now, was Rabbi Yosef Ibn Kaspi's, one could call it a perush, but it is essentially a very in-depth hakdama to Megillat Esther, and then a kind of a bit part commentary on certain pesukim of the various chapters. And when I came across his rational reading of seeing the miraculous within the natural, I thought this has to be available in English. And this forward-thinking and very motivating presentation of how one can create more favorable outcomes for Am Yisrael has to be publicized. And I'm pleased we were able to do that today.
So Ibn Kaspi, I'll just jump in and add, and there's an episode on the podcast a couple of years ago with Rabbi Bezel Herring discussing it. And Ibn Kaspi lives late 13th century, early 14th century. He's in Provence, in South France. He travels around. He's in Maimonidean, an extreme Maimonidean at that. And he writes many commentaries and many different things. Okay, so as you say, it's really a lengthy introduction. We'll talk about that. There's a lengthy introduction and kind of a little bit of commentary. And the introduction you translated, it's a translation, and the commentary is an adaptation. So let's talk about those two things. First of all, just process-wise, why did you translate the introduction and the commentary adapted?
So the introduction is, as I say, the bulk of the material. And in there, he presents the main challenge that he sees, or the main question that one asks when they read Megillat Esther in a logical manner, which is, how can you have a decree set by Persian law, essentially, which doesn't allow decrees to get revoked, then have another decree, time after, which essentially can overcome that original decree? How could it be? If the law of Persia states that one cannot revoke a decree, how can you have this later decree? Ibn Ezra, he says, challenges the notion and says, it was a forgery, the original decree. He said, no, this isn't a logical way of looking at it. And using his understanding of logic and his understanding of, ancient Persian law, he overcomes it with a unique solution. And as I say, the bulk of this is in the Hakdama. So, I felt that should be the main thing translated word for word, with brief annotations to just assist the reader, but it's a pretty clearly presented Hakdama anyway. And then for the commentary, it's just a few pesukim that he will, comment on. That we thought, let's present that as an adaptation in English with the story presented of Megillat Esther, and then, sprinkled in with some of Ibn Kaspi's unique insights and clarifications. So the bulk of the book, as I say, is the introduction, and that's where you really see the beauty of Ibn Kaspi's approach to the text, which I'm sure we'll give some examples to as well.
Yeah, I think you can give them right now. Like, what are those examples? Like, what to give a kind of flavor, his style of Ibn Kaspi as it comes to Esther.
So, you mentioned him initially as, this extreme Maimonidean, which, as we've discussed before, I challenge the notion of extreme and of Maimonidean. He was, for all intents and purposes, a follower of the Gaonic Sephardi tradition that had developed in southern France after the Andalusian arrivals in 1147. So he was very much an intellectual product of that worldview. And that worldview, reading Tanakh in a more logical way, trying to see what the logic behind the text is, informs some of these examples. So there's this, the crux of his argument is a logical one, which is, as I mentioned, these two decrees. How could it logically be possible? And that is definitely, I would say, the standout feature of the Hakdama. But another example would be how he sees providence essentially as political causality. So this is his observation. He sees, Mordechai is using a superior communication system. There are these later letters through, this Persian word Ahashteranim, which is basically these kind of royal steeds, royal horses. These later letters were sent with expediency and haste. It's mentioned in the Megillat Esther, chapter 8. Whereas the earlier letters were sent by runners. Now, he makes a striking inference. He's saying that in some distant provinces, the later letters may have arrived before the first. So if we think of the original letters, we're looking at a letter that essentially states, okay, the Jews should be killed. That is something that is presented to the non-Jews. Whereas the later letter or the later decree is for the Jews. And that is not a contradiction of the first letter. It's basically telling the Jews they can defend themselves. So you do not have a conflict there. You've got one targeted towards the non-Jews, they can kill. You've got the second letter targeted towards the Jews, you can defend yourselves. And he sees through Mordechai's activities the ability to create this second decree, which is essentially providence as political causality. So you've got this 9-month psychological campaign built into the plot, and that is the miracle. And it's essentially saying to the Jews, or saying to Am Yisrael, you can mark your way in the world. Providence is there through the activity, through the hishtadlut, essentially, that you are, involved in, rather than, how we commonly understand miracles. And I think that is classical Geonic Sephardi approach to finding the miraculous in the natural.
Jackson, I'll turn to you. I want to ask you, what do you have to add, especially as the translator, when it pertains to the introduction?
Yeah, right. So I was privileged to kind of be on the broader translation team and kind of have the final look through and approval of the translation. I think what stood out to me is, as I think Sina nicely said, his Hakdama is really his main thrust of his commentary. He really lays it all out in the Hakdama, and that he writes in there itself is kind of his main goal. Even his comments themselves later are very, very terse and very brief. I think what stood out to me about Ibn Kaspi's approach is that he writes in a very clear style, perhaps unlike Ibn Ezra. When you read the Hakdama, even in the Hebrew, I think his arguments flow very nicely, and there's not a ton of guesswork as to what exactly he's trying to say. However, his decision to be terse in his comments is not through his linguistic style. It's more that he will simply cut off whatever he's saying by noting, I'm not going to lengthen the discussion here. I'm not going to really explain what I mean here, or I'm going to kind of leave this in your hands. So he kind of explicitly states, I'm being terse for your benefit versus this is just my, my writing style. And so I know Sina just spoke a lot about providence. So, we point out that he notes there are many explanations of the nature of the providence in this story about, the king's insomnia and all the different little events that seem to piece together. And he notes that, many commentaries before me and Chazal themselves have a lot of things to say about this and different explanations, but I'm not going to explain it. I'm not going to lengthen about it. I'm not going to offer anything to the reader here. You can, implicitly understand from that, you read my Hakdama that I wrote my views in, and you read the Megillah with my kind of framework, and perhaps you will get to kind of my understanding of these things, but to sort of spoil the surprise, if you will, or kind of tell the end point before you get there, is to ruin the whole experience that his commentary is meant to kind of generate, where you're supposed to kind of read his Hakdama, then reread the Megillah, which he assumes you're already familiar with, and kind of get there yourself almost.
Interesting. And what would you say the translation process was like? Especially, you mentioned Ibn Ezra and the difference and the comparison between Ibn Ezra and Ibn Kaspi, and you've translated Ibn Ezra as well.
Yeah, I think this was definitely an easier experience to check over. As I said, Ibn Kaspi, I think, is a bit of a clearer Hebrew writer, or at least he chooses to be. I think that there's always the question of his usage of logical syllogisms and other types of definitions and terms, which someone back then would perhaps be more familiar with than those of us today reading it. So, the importance of making some of those terms a bit more colloquial or adding annotations when necessary. But I think the beauty of Ibn Kaspi in the Hebrew even is that it's much more the reader is much more able to just kind of read as it flows through without as much of a need, at least in my view, of, needing to supplement with extra words or bracketed paragraphs and, long explanations of what exactly the literal words are trying to say. So in that experience, I find it to be much more readable from a baseline.
And I also think, if you zoom out and put this Perush of Ibn Kaspi alongside some of his other works, his philosophical works, and you see him quoting the concept of there being, sod, esoteric secrets, if you like, within the text, one can go away with a reading that he sees an allegorical representation of God, Lahavdil, in King Ahasuerus, and of Satan in Haman. And through this esoteric lens, and there's a great, it's mentioned in the preface that I wrote, I've quoted Robert Eisen, who's written a great piece on this. He finds that the legal problem of overturning that, irrevocable royal decree is actually a theological exploration of how God's seemingly immutable prophetic decrees of doom can be averted. Because remember, he comes from this philosophical tradition that sees God as unchanging. So if King Ahasuerus has given this unchanging decree, Ibn Kaspi essentially looks at this as negative prophecies can contain unstated conditions, but human beings can overcome those decrees by exploiting the conditions, just like Mordechai found the legal space in Ahasuerus' unchanging edict. And what you can go away, again, seeing it in the context of his other writings elsewhere, he essentially sees Purim as a naturalistic blueprint for Jewish history and the Messianic era. You can sense that ultimate redemption to Ibn Kaspi isn't something that's going to arrive through supernatural miracles or some sort of passive piety, but through proactive human initiative, political strategy, military self-defense. It reminds me of Harambam in the letter on astrology, where he kind of chastises the reason, the temple being destroyed because we didn't necessarily learn the art of war, and we relied on the kind of vanities of astrology and superstitious elements rather than actually the hishtadlut of political maneuvering. And I think that's a very unique aspect of this that I think is the undercurrent once read in the context of his other writings.
Who would you say the book is for?
I would say it is for everybody and anybody that sees the Purim story in its Pshat sense and wants to have a more Pshat reading of what they assume is the Pshat. There's what the majority think is Pshat, and then there is what Ibn Kaspi and others in the Gaonic Sephardi tradition view Pshat as being. I think someone who is a logical thinker and wants to see the rigorous craft of logic, which is what Ibn Kaspi refers to it as, being used as a tool to understand our sacred Tanakh. I think this would be very useful for them, and it really makes you understand that the Purim story, the miracle that is occurring through the natural, is something that has relevance in our lives. It shows how providence and Hakadosh Baruch Hu essentially run our lives in a way that may not be presented in a biblical, miraculous way, but it is through the actions that we are involved in and actuate in our own reality. So it almost naturalizes or brings the Purim story in a more sensible manner. And by sensible, I mean literally for us able to sense in a much more familiar kind of setting.
What are you trying to accomplish with this work?
I think we're trying to accomplish, I would say, one of the chief objectives of Da'at Press. When I founded it, I had a big passion and desire and motivation to have many of our Orthodox Jewish community friends and otherwise seeing the Torah through a lens that utilizes the tools of science and philosophy in uncovering some of the most beautiful aspects of it. And I think Ibn Kaspi's naturalization, against the Western term we're using, but the naturalization of a otherwise just a supernatural story, I think is a prime example of one of the chief objectives of Da'at Press, which is to allow Jews and others to see the beauty of Hakadosh Baruch Hu and providence, essentially, manifest in the natural life that we live. So within nature is the miracle. And I think this is a perfect example of it, which ties into the fact that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name is not mentioned in Megillat Esther. And this is why the Hachamim say that when all the, books of Tanakh, Messianic era comes about, it's the only one that will remain, one of the only ones that will remain is the, Megillat Esther. It's a mature understanding of providence. And I think it kind of matches exactly what we're trying to achieve here at Dart Press. So what would you say, Jackson?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would just add is that I think, highlighting figures like Ibn Kaspi is a good demonstration of how a lot of these ideas, ways of studying and approaching these tasks is not, it's not based on ethnic boundaries or countries of origin, etc. You have people like Kaspi, are part of totally different places in Europe, Provence, etc., which are not obviously Spanish, Andalusian, from the Middle East, Gaonic, Bavel, but nevertheless, they carry the same types of teachings and the same methodologies, and they try to kind of carry that forward across the national boundaries, if you will.
Exactly right. It highlights the example of ideology over ethnicity.
Thank you both for joining once again. I'll link to in the show notes where you can purchase the book on Amazon, on Dot Press. You can use what's the code, Sina? Chatter? Remind me what the code is.
It was Sephorim Chatter 26. Sephorim Chatter 26.
We'll put a code in the show notes. You can buy it from Dot Press and get a discount for the book. And so, thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.